Welcome to Viking Legacy and Lore. The episode you're about to hear will give you a deeper understanding of the legends and lore of the Viking Age and carry your imagination straight into their world. Before we dive in, I want to say thank you. I'm giving away a copy of the Sagas of the Icelanders to one listener as a way to say thank you. All you have to do is send an email to vikinglegacyandlore@gmail.com. Do that before July 4th to enter. The winner will be announced during the following episode. And now, the episode you've been waiting for. What if your map was wrong? What if the island on the horizon, the one you've been rowing towards, with arching arms and salt-dried mouth, wasn't land at all, but something alive and something waiting? Welcome to the episode on Viking sea monsters, from Kraken to the island that swallowed men whole. In this episode, we dive into the darkest corners of Norse seafaring myth, where the ocean wasn't just dangerous, it was alive, where sailors feared not just storms, but what waited beneath the surface. Monsters older than memory, too big for drawings, and too terrifying for names. Yes, we'll get to the Kraken, the tentacled terror, the one you've seen in books and movies and myths. But first, you'll meet the creature that came before. The false island, the mouth in the sea, the beast the Vikings whispered about when the waves were too still, the one they called Hafgufa. Most people think sea monsters are just sailor stories, things they made up because they didn't have science. But the Vikings were smarter than that. They used these stories like maps, not just to avoid danger, but to remember it, to pass it down, to survive it. In this episode, we'll follow a crew that rows towards what they believed is shelter, only to find themselves caught in the jaws of something far worse. Then, we'll pull back and explore the real sea monster myths of the Viking world, the snake that lay at the bottom of the ocean, the island that wasn't. I'll show you how these stories evolved and how the Kraken, centuries later, rose out of the Norse waters to become the sea's most famous nightmare. And finally, we'll bring it home to you. Because even if you're not sailing in the North Atlantic, you felt it. That rising panic, the moment when things you trusted turned on you, that creeping sense that something big is about to pull you under. The Vikings had a name for that, and they faced it head on. By the end of this episode, so will you. The longship rocked like a cradle on a windless bed of the sea. Not a breath stirred, no gulls cried, only the creak of wood swollen with salt and the quiet drip of the ocean sweat from the oars now resting. Eric leaned over the edge, his fingers brushing the water like he hoped it might speak. He was 12, maybe 13, still soft in the face, but salt-worn in the eyes. The boy of a dead fisherman, taken in by Skari and the crew like a stray kitten. And there it was, a shape beneath the fog, dark, wide, still, not moving, not surging, simply there in the middle of nowhere. "An island," said Thorlok, or maybe Gunni. A blessing," someone else muttered. "Shelter," another agreed, voice half drowned in sleep. Eric squinted. He saw black stones, or so he thought. Pale gulls circled lazily, painting white loops in the stillness. A few vines of seaweed danced atop the waves, and the smell, wet kelp and brine. Yes, but there was something else, something like eggs gone sour. Old Skari, beard like frost and eyes like milk turned, spat into the sea. "This place, it feels wrong." Nobody answered because they were already rowing. Oars dripped like tired prayers. The ship crept towards the shape. The rock-slick ridge curved out of the water, gentle like the spine of a sleeping whale. Seaweed hung from it like hair. No movement, no sound, just quiet as the grave. "Easy now," said Thorlok. We'll tie up just there. See that outcropping? The men stood. Ropes were fetched. The bow turned. A light wind began to hum, just enough to flutter Eric's tunic. And then, a shudder. Tiny at first, like a heartbeat. Then another, stronger. The water began to tremble. Gulls screamed and rose. The ship rocked sideways. Oars hit the water with hollow thuds. What was that? The seaweed slid, not drifted, slid across the black stone. The rocks tilted. What Eric had thought was the ledge was an eyelid. Then the sea inhaled. Not storm, not wind, just a pull. Deep, monstrous, steady. A low groan echoed up from the sea's belly. Wood began to snap. The ship jolted. A barrel rolled and burst. Back, Skari roared. But the current was teeth now. The prow tipped. The sea beneath the island had opened. Not a crevice, not a whirlpool. A mouth. Rows of barnacle, cloaked ridges, black as void. The throat wide as a fjord. The breath from beneath, hot, fetid, and ancient, rushing upward like the sea was alive and hungry. Men screamed. Ropes flew. The sea pulled like it had names to swallow. Eric grabbed the mast and clung as the world tilted. He saw Thorlock slip, boots gone, arms out screaming until the foam ate him. The mouth widened, and somewhere in the black of it, an eye opened. Not like a man's, not even like a beast, flat, endless, reflecting the sky, the ship, and the terror of every soul aboard. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The pulse ceased, the water settled, the mouth closed. The island was an island again. Gulls returned, circling. The fog thickened again, as if ashamed of what it had revealed. Skari was the first to speak, his voice little more than a scratch in his throat. That was no island. The crew sat or stood, not knowing what to do. A rope drifted across the deck like a snake trying to remember how to slither. Someone vomited, someone else prayed. Eric didn't speak. He didn't cry. He only stared, his hands still tight around the mast, his mouth dry, because in that moment he understood what the sea really was. Not water, not home, not a path to glory. A place with a mind of its own, and sometimes a mouth. The Vikings were not fools. They were not just raiders with beards and axes, roaring into battle for gold, glory, and silver. They were seafarers, navigators, survivors of some of the harshest, most unpredictable waters on Earth. And when you spent your life on the sea, without a motor, without radar, without GPS, you start to notice things, strange things. You see fog that moves like it's alive. You hear splashes too loud for any fish. You wake up in the middle of the night because the waves suddenly stopped. And that silence is worse than any storm. The Vikings didn't just sail through these mysteries. They named them. They told stories of what might be beneath. One of those stories spoke of a great serpent, one so massive it stretched across the sea, wrapped around the world like a living fence. They said its body moved like rolling thunder underwater, and when it shifted, it caused earthquakes, and when it finally rises, its breath will poison the sky. They believed it would only surface at the end of the world, and when that day comes, even the gods will fall. That wasn't just a story to the Vikings, it was a warning. Stay away from the edge, it said. Some waters are too deep. Then there were tales of a different kind of monster, one that didn't fight, it tricked you. Imagine this. You're sailing in the open ocean. You've been rowing for days. Your hands are cracked, your lips are salt burnt. And then hope. You see what looks like land. A small island, maybe just big enough to rest. You steer the ship towards it. The water calms. too calm. You see seabirds circling. You see seaweed floating. It must be land, but it's not. As you get closer, the island starts to breathe. The surface ripples, the rocks shift, and then the water begins to pull, not like a wave or a tide, but like a mouth. Because that island, it's not an island. It's a creature. A creature so big, no one ever saw the whole thing, only parts. A back shaped like a ridge of rock, eyes the size of shields, and a mouth that opened wider than a fjord. The Vikings believed this thing didn't chase ships. It waited, pretended to be something safe, something still, and when sailors dropped anchor, it opened. That was its gift, deception. It didn't need to swim fast or roar. It only needed you to trust the sea, and then it swallowed you whole. And yes, these stories were terrifying, but they were also very practical, because the Vikings used monster stories like maps. Let's say there's a stretch of sea where current pulls harder than they should, or a strange fog appears no matter the season, or birds vanish. They didn't just say, the weather's weird. They said, that's where the serpent sleeps, or that's the false island's hunting ground. These weren't bedtime tales. They were navigational tools. They were stories meant to teach the next generation where not to go. And sometimes they were used to protect secrets. Let's say a captain found a hidden harbor, calm, full of fish, unknown to enemies. He didn't want anyone else finding it, so he'd return to the village and say, "We lost 3 men to the sea, saw the eye, the false island, it almost took us. Stay away from that water." Fear kept his discovery safe. In this way, sea monsters became more than just myths. They became strategy. But here's what's most surprising. As strange as these stories sound, some of them might be closer to reality than we think. Modern scientists have discovered that the ocean really does hide massive creatures. Squid larger than a school bus, whales the size of small islands, and yes, currents that can pull you under so fast it's like something grabbing your ship. And think about this. If you were a Viking and saw a dead giant squid washed up on shore, tentacles as thick as a man's arm, eyes as black as moons, what would you think? You'd probably say, there's more where that came from. And you'd tell your crew to keep watch. And you'd tell your children, never trust calm waters. So while you might call these stories myths, for the Vikings, they were memories, they were warnings, and they were truths shaped like monsters. And if you were wondering, hold on a second, isn't that starting to sound like the Kraken? Yes, exactly. The stories are changing, the names are shifting, but the monster, it's still down there. And in the next part, we'll show you how the Kraken rose out of these Viking waters, not as a serpent, not as a false island, but as a new kind of fear, a fear that would take over the world. Most people think the Kraken began with sailors in the 1600s, those long sea voyages where men went mad, saw shapes in the mist and made up tales to pass the time. But that's only the second half of the story. To understand the Kraken, you have to go back before maps showed every coastline, back before the compass, back to the Viking world, the people who sailed farther, faster, and braver than any before them. They may not have used the word Kraken, but they told its story, piece by piece, a monster made from older monsters. The Vikings believed in a world under the waves, not just full of fish and storms, but creatures with minds. Some were massive, some were clever, some just waited. That false island from earlier, it sounds a lot like the Kraken. A creature that doesn't just chase you, it lets you come to it. But here's the twist. Over time, these stories didn't just fade, they evolved. The old Viking sagas were passed down, told again and again in Iceland, Norway, Greenland. And as new sailors explored, especially in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, they added to the legends. They said, yes, the old stories were true, but the monster has arms now, long ones that can pull ships under. They began describing a creature with tentacles, eyes as big as shields, a hunger that never ended. They called it many things. But by the 1700s, one name had taken over: Kraken. And what does that name mean? It comes from an old word in Norwegian and Germanic languages meaning twisted or unhealthy or crooked beast. It wasn't just a creature, it was a warning. Now here's where it gets even stranger. The first detailed Kraken description came not from pirate tales or drunken rumors, but from scientists. Yes, scientists. In 1752, a bishop in Norway wrote a natural history book. He claimed the Kraken was real. He said it looked like a floating island with arms that could rise from the sea like serpents. He also said it could sink a ship just by rising underneath it. Does that sound familiar? It should. It sounds almost exactly like the Viking tale of the creature that pretended to be an island, Hafgufa. Same shape, same trap, same deadly claim. So what happened? Simple. The Kraken is a remix of older Viking monsters, a mashup of the serpent that circles the world, the island that eats men, and the beast whose mouth is the sea itself. Viking stories didn't disappear. They hid inside later legends. They grew new names, new shapes, new teeth. But here's the part most people miss. The Kraken didn't just stay in stories. It became part of the sailor's mindset. If you were a captain and your crew started panicking in the fog, you told them, the Kraken is near, tie everything down. And suddenly, they listened. Not because it was true, but because it gave shape to their fear. That's what the Vikings did too. They took their terror of storms, strange currents, vanishing ships, and they gave it a face, a name, a monster. Not to make things worse, but to make things clearer. Naming the fear made it manageable, made it possible to avoid or survive. Even now, centuries later, the Kraken is still with us. It lives in books, in movies, in games, in our imaginations. But what we forgot is, it came from real sailors, from the oceans, from real danger. The Vikings didn't invent the Kraken from thin air. They saw something, strange shapes, dead whales with wounds too large for sharks, tentacles bigger than any octopus they knew, currents that pulled entire boats down like a hand grabbing at your ankle. So while they didn't use the word Kraken, they gave it its bones and gave it its blood, and the sea has carried it forward. Fast forward, it's no longer the Viking Age. No long ships, no shield maidens, no war horns echoing across fjords. It's the 18th century now, and in the cold, gray stretch of water between Norway and Greenland, a new kind of ship moves through the mist. A fishing vessel, wooden, weather-beaten, crewed by men who no longer call themselves Vikings but still carry their blood. And their fear of the sea, that hasn't changed. It still lives deep in their bones. They called their ship the Swan, a humble name for a humble crew. Cod and herring, that's what they were after. Nothing glorious, nothing strange, but the ocean had other plans. The captain, Henrik Olsen, would later write that he felt the air go flat. No wind, no bird song, no splash of fish breaking the surface. Just fog, thick, white, a wall of nothing. Then came the smell. At first they thought it was a dead whale, but no whale ever stank like that. It was like rotting seaweed, burnt oil, and something else. Something like iron and old blood. The youngest boy, Anders, vomited over the side. Then the bubbles rose. Not small ones, but massive gulps of ocean-belching air as if something was exhaling from deep below. The boat rocked, and then tentacles. not all at once, black and barnacled. It breached the surface without a splash, just sliding up like a snake from a dream. One of the men screamed, another dropped to his knees and began to pray in Danish. Henrik didn't scream. He just watched, because he had read about this in a dusty book written by a bishop, a book that most people laughed at. The creature in the book? It had no name in the old sagas, but now people were calling it Kraken. The tentacle slipped back beneath the water. Another followed, smaller, then a third. It didn't attack. It didn't roar. It just moved. It moved beneath them, larger than the boat, shifting the water without waves. Henrik would later write that the sea tipped slightly, as though the swan was no longer on water, but balancing on something, rising. That was when the fish began to jump, thousands of them leaping from the sea like they were trying to flee into the sky. Silver bodies slapping against the deck. Anders fell, screaming, his face cut by a flying mackerel. Then the sea boiled, not from heat, but from chaos, water surging outward, not from wind, but from force. Something was rising, something big enough to push the ocean out of its way. They never saw the whole thing, just pieces. A bulge the size of a hill, a maw like a cavern, a glimpse in the flash of foam, the tentacles curling, uncoiling, impossibly long. Then just as fast as it had appeared, it sank. No splash, no roar, just a pull, gentle, heavy, like the ocean taking a deep breath and going still again. The fog lifted, the birds returned, and the swan drifted, half filled with fish and silence. Henrik wrote down what had happened. He didn't try to explain it. He didn't try to claim glory. He just wrote, "We saw the mouth of the sea. We floated on its back, and it let us live." The record exists. It was passed down, and many dismissed it. But some, especially those who've worked the same waters, nod slowly when they hear the tale, because they've felt it too. The cold silence, the breath from below, the feeling that something massive is just beneath the surface, not chasing you, just watching. Let's take a step back. We've traveled with Vikings across the ice blue sea. We've watched a false island open its jaws. We've stood on the deck of a fog-wrapped fishing boat while something ancient brushes against the hull. And we've heard the name of the serpent, the swallower, the hidden mouth, the Kraken. And now, let's ask the bigger question. Why do these monsters still matter? Because deep down, we still believe in them. No, maybe not as tentacled beasts waiting just offshore. But the fear, the feeling, the truth beneath the surface, that's never left. The Vikings were teaching us something, and not just about the sea. They knew that the world was full of dangers that pretended to be safe. The false island, the calm fog, the moment just before it pulled you under. It's not always the storm you should fear, it's the silence, the easy path, the harbor that promises rest but hides a trap. We've all rode towards something like that, like a blessing only to find out it had teeth. A job, a relationship, an idea, a system, a secret. It looked still, it looked solid, and then it opened its mouth. And so what did the Vikings do? Well, they didn't give up. They didn't stop sailing. They just simply named the monster. They said, that's the serpent that waits at the edge of the world. That's the beast that hides as an island. That is the Kraken. Not to glorify it, but to remind each other, you're not crazy. You feel the fear. That's not weakness. That's your instinct recognizing danger before your brain can explain it. The monster is real. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is row away. But sometimes you row through it. Sometimes, like young Henrik, you don't get a choice. The creature rises and you face it. And if you survive, you carry the story. That's how monsters become maps. Because naming your fear doesn't just protect you, it guides others. It says, this place is not safe. I've been there. Let me tell you what it looks like. And that's something we still don't do enough today. We act like we're the first to feel this afraid, the first to be swallowed by grief or anxiety or betrayal. But we're not. The Vikings felt it. The sailors in the 1700s felt it. And the truth is, we feel it too. The sea may have changed, but the monster is still there. Sometimes it's a voice in your head telling you you're not enough. Sometimes it's pressure to keep rowing when you know something is off. Sometimes it's the moment you realize the thing you trusted is about to break you. And yet somehow we're still afloat. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that the sea was kind, not that the creature slept, but that we're still here, still rowing, still naming the monsters for others to see. So the next time you feel like you're sailing into something unknown, remember Hafgufa. Remember the serpent. Remember the quiet-eyed Kraken beneath the fog. They don't always come to crush you. Sometimes they rise just to see if you notice. Sometimes they let you live so you'll tell the tale. And now you know the story. So what do we make of it all? A sea monster that pretended to be an island. A serpent said to strangle the world. A kraken that rose without roaring, nearly swallowing an entire crew. We've crossed 1,000 years of fear and folklore, and myth turned memory, and memory turned map. But this was never just about the sea monster. This was about something deeper. Something that the Vikings taught us, that monsters don't always charge at you with claws and teeth. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they wear a mask of comfort. They look like calm water, safe ground, and they let you get close. And that's what makes them so dangerous. But they also taught us this. When you name the monster, you take away its power. You see it clearly, you learn where it hides, you pass the knowledge on. And maybe that's what you needed today. Not a story about tentacles and false islands, but a reminder that fear is real and survivable. You're not weak for feeling it. You're not broken because something tried to swallow you. You're still here. You've lived. And that means you carry a story someone else needs to hear. So go speak it. Name the monster, row through the fog, and when you reach the shore, tell the tale. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Send it to a friend who's facing foggy waters. Tag someone who's rowing through something unseen. And leave us a review. Leave a review so that others can find us through the fog, and find us on their voyage. And if you've got a story, a moment where the sea shifted and something stared back, I want to hear it. Send it to me. Viking Legacy and Lore at gmail.com, or leave it in the comments. Look, the monsters may sleep, but the sea always remembers, and so do we. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Till next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.